Julie Snyder, Richard Rushing, and Stephen Singh. You should probably, I should give a special recognition to Richard for being one of our longest term members of CFF when we started, and he has never missed one of these events which he did. So great to have you all back. And Lalit, it's yours, sir. Okay, thank you.
Thank you all. Hope you're having a lot of fun over here. We saw the last presentation around the supply chain and M&Ms. That was sweet. And we'll try to make it sweeter with this panel. So with me joining is some elite panel here. We have Stephen from Zscaler, Julie, who is the privacy expert, and you will hear a lot from her, working with MITRE, and Richard with Motorola. So we'll just do a quick round of introduction before we get started with the topic over here. So my name is Lalit Ahluwalia. I'm the CEO for Inspira Enterprise. We are a kind of global cybersecurity service provider. And prior to this, I managed some global and the national cyber practices for Deloitte, Accenture, and others. Without boring or making it any more boring for you all, the genesis of this topic and what you'll hear from the panel and why they're here is why, even till date, after all the advancements in cybersecurity, we still are behind the bad actors. What is it what we're really missing, and what our C-suite and the board needs to know that is more relevant to them? But before we go further, so let's start with the introductions here. Stephen?
Appreciate it. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. And the slot right after lunch is always the toughest. Hopefully you're all on the sugar high still. I represent Zscaler. I run our mergers, acquisitions, divestitures, private equity practice. And you may wonder, how does that fit into the world of cybersecurity? What's interesting around the concept of zero trust, not only is it incredibly important to protect the inside and the outside of the enterprise and also the supply chain, but it also is used to modernize your most important business processes, such as transaction advisory services. So you work with some of the largest customers in the world, many of them Fortune 1000s, on accelerating transactions, integrations, separations, private equity carve-outs, using zero trust and best practices to cybersecurity. Prior to that, I spent quite a few years running global IT practices, cybersecurity practices, as well as management consulting. So a wide range of experience across the entire side of buy side, sell side, and in between for advisory.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm Julie Snyder, and I work with MITRE. We're a not-for-profit that operates federally funded research and development centers that work in the public interest, and I am the privacy lead for our center that supports the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST. I've been in cybersecurity for 23 years, privacy for 17. I'm really thrilled to be here today and looking forward to seeing where the discussion goes.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Richard Rushing. I am CISO for Motorola Mobility. I've been CISO now 16 years in one place, which I should have been dead a long time ago. For that side of it that's there, I've been doing cybersecurity pretty much all my life, which is, I won't date it, but it's 40 plus years on that side of it. I am old, as I refer to it as, and that's okay. I run the cybersecurity program for Motorola, also our parent company, Lenovo, as well. So I'm dealt with cybersecurity from the side of it and seen the evolution on this side very, very well. I've also worked for large multinational conglomerates, GE, Siemens, but I've also helped founded 4 successful startups and exited out on that side of it. So I've been on both sides of the coin, as well as looking for challenges and trying to find innovative solutions around that.
Right. Thank you, Richard. And you can very well see the panel over here and their experience, the rich experience they bring. So starting with the topic, let's set the stage here. So we all understand in today's time and world, the cybersecurity spend is tremendously increasing. In fact, the last data showed like we're spending almost 150 billion plus across in cybersecurity. And still, we're getting breached. In fact, just a few weeks back, we had another high-profile breach. that happened. So what are we missing here? Despite spending all this money and the funding only getting more and more, we're still getting hijacked. What's the reason?
It's interesting you mentioned a few weeks ago a major breach. Feels like it's happening every day. And maybe we've all become numb to it. When you walk in, have a discussion in a forum like this, I won't do this to any of you, but if I asked you truthfully, if your company or you personally have been breached or violated in some way from a cyber perspective, I think every single one of us raises our hand. And we're numb to it. And if you think about it, think about your own personal atomic unit of how you've protected yourself working from home on your favorite, PlayStation or your PC. You've done everything you possibly can, and you're still going to be taken advantage of and culpable. So can we spend more? I think Gartner announced record investment in IT security this coming year on a down economy, which is unprecedented. And I don't think that spend has really been reflected in a way that the IT organizations and cybersecurity groups can digest it. They're still doing all the right things. If you start with basic hygiene, and forgive me, it was brought up earlier today, patch management, endpoint security, multi-factor authentication, having a SOC and a SIM, having an awareness program, those are all really good things. But what they never took into account is the attack surface. The attack surface has doubled, tripled, quadrupled. And I'll just give you the best metaphor. If you think about the attack surface, most folks today in a pre-existing mindset think about protecting your assets within the physical walls of your campuses, your branches, and your data center. And then remember, your transformation journey is to actually get out of them. For the past 3 years, your entire workforce has been working from home. You no longer can protect the four walls. Your most important assets, which is your data and your applications, are now sitting in your favorite cloud service provider. So you built this castle and moat architecture to protect something that is an absolute shell with nothing in between. So if you think about the attack surface, which is really driving a lot of the complexity, it's purely because you're expanding your attack surface because you're moving your users and applications where they should be, which is not within the perimeters of that facility.
I think it's basically cybersecurity is hard. It is really hard. Unfortunately, if you think about the organization, it is one thing that touches everything from the end user, from a person in a factory, all the way up to a CEO that's there. It touches your supply chain, third-party suppliers, privacy. Everything is covered across the board in an organization. It is hard to get everything there. And we're playing defense. I give you 0 day. Good example of this. How do you defend against the 0 day of an unknown attack that's going to compromise and get something that's there? You can't, or it's really, really, really hard. Or you're impacting your business productivity because the security controls are so stringent that you're not allowing your employees and the rest of the company to be productive. So it is a balancing act, and it is hard, but it's based on risk. And sometimes the risks come from out of left field and you don't recognize those and don't see those. Ransomware is one of those things that cropped up and was like, surprise! And I think this is just the normal cybersecurity side of it. You're going to have those surprises. You're going to have things that weren't a big deal last year and now are the huge thing that all attackers are leveraging and doing. And the simple fact, there's an interesting article that talked about the migration to the cloud and why people were doing it. And security was the #1 answer. They affected that says, if I put it in the cloud, it'll be secure. And there's some misconceptions around cybersecurity, especially from the business side of it. That's, hey, I look at all the news articles and it's there. But you can reverse that around. So we talk about breaches and things around that side of it. There are about 13 billion credentials floating around the dark web that's there. Go back and do the reverse math on that. How many credentials are reported in the breach? And you'll discover that it's just over about 35%. So according to everybody that's reported everything, wait, we're missing about 65% of things that actually happened because there's no way the accounts, if the accounts are out there, guess what? You had a breach. Well, someone either didn't know about it or didn't report it. And that's a large portion of the sides of it that's actually there. And I think this is just the nomenclature of that. It is not easy. It is hard. And it is a people, process, and technology problem wrapped in this package of risks that you're going to have to make your own formula, because every business is different. I can't take a cookie cutter, but I can sometimes take what is successful in one organization, modify it, and it'll be successful in my organization as well. But I usually can't take an exact copy of this and go, hey, guess what? This will work perfectly. So it's all about that. And this is one of, I think, the biggest thing that you can do is communicate with other people. What works in you? I have a problem. There are 100 people in here that can give you solutions to those problems and different cost as well. That's where you get that's how you become successful. Talk to people and find out what you're trying to solve. There's probably already an answer for it. And guess what? You can figure out what's the best answer for your organization.
Now, and that's so well said, right? And we talked about in the previous sessions a little bit about the social media. Like we talked about how many high school kids are in, how many you have TikTok. How many of you really know, like, that platform was breached and there was billions of records that were stolen? So it's not just limited to security. It's about the privacy as well. So what is it like, with the heightened notices on privacy and still we experience all these privacy breaches? What's not working, Julie?
Yeah. No, I think there are a lot of challenges that come in when you introduce that notion of privacy, and starting with the fundamentals of there is no one universally recognized definition of privacy. So if I asked every one of you in this room what it meant to you, there'd probably be some commonality, but many of you would have distinct nuances to that answer. So how do we define it to begin with? Coupled with that, privacy and the notions of it are heavily based in law and regulation, which just hasn't and can't keep pace with technology. So all of these new things come about, and our laws and regulations, especially here in the US, are just not positioned well to handle all of those different technological implications. And so that's part of the challenge. I think too, on the consumer end of things and us as individuals, we don't always know what we're signing up for. So there are privacy notions built into our fabric where notice and choice and consent are supposed to be there. But when you're reading these agreements and not really understanding what goes on behind the general language in them, you really don't know what you're saying yes to. So yes, sure, you can share this stuff for efficiency or to offer me this cool service, but I don't know what that looks like behind the scenes and what kind of profile you're building and how you're trying to influence me built on that profile and those types of things. So that's kind of where it starts, and then.
Yeah, no, I think you bring up a good point. I'll give a question out there is think about the cookie settings that you get, and it pops up to you and says, please make the selection yes or no, and here's the advanced setting. No one clicks on advanced. They click on yes. Stop, let me do what I need to do. And it could be like, we're going to steal all your data. Is that okay? Sure. I just agreed to it.
I think one of the other challenges that I see that connects to this too, and some of it goes into how you design and interfaces and that sort of thing, and certainly all of the technology underneath, but there's this air gap between these organizational behaviors and expectations that are built into the legal framework and what systems are actually designed to do. How do you build them? How do you engineer them? So we talk about things like minimization and limiting the amount of information that you're collecting in the first place and processing as you own it. If you look at an engineer and say, go do minimization, they're going to look at you and say, I need a few more details on what that means. And so trying to connect those dots between, what are we intending to do versus what the technology does. And that doesn't even account for how do individuals experience the privacy issues on the other end. So we need more information around how do we have a meaningful conversation about what individuals experience from a privacy perspective to start building more of that in.
And I think all are great points and very well said. As a service provider, I work with a number of clients in my role. Couple other things I'll add to the mix is what's not working. Is number one, in the name of being cool, we have made security very complex, overly complex. Every time something new comes up, a new threat, there's a new tool, a new technology thrown at you. On top of that, what we're also trying to do is kind of pull all this thing together without really looking at the integration of that. And when we're not really making something overly complex, it's bound to have those flaws and the gaps. And it's not easy to understand what's really going on. And then people and organizations are still going with the compliance mindset, the compliance-centric approach. Whereas really is there a risk, and start applying that as the first lenses. So that being said, what is the board and the C-suite need to start looking at? So we're understanding that yes, we are spending a lot on cybersecurity and privacy. Still, we're really kind of like, chasing the bad actors, still getting breached. What are the KPIs and the KRIs or kind of metrics that the board or C-suite need to kind of start looking at to really get something out of the spend that they're really making today? So let's start with you, Rich, at this time.
So this is a pet peeve of mine because we do it wrong most of the time. I've seen a lot of board presentations in my 10 years, and it's hard because everybody's different. You have to do this understanding. But typically, we will flash what we refer to as a blackjack chart, or, hey, red, yellow, red, green, here's a bunch of things. But we list our skill sets. Okay, the board does not care about skills that you actually have. That's good for finance and everything else. A board does not, because it doesn't tie to the business. Your IAM is not tied to the business. It will impact the business if it goes down, but there is nothing that ties it to the business. So if you're talking to the board, you talk either in dollars or risk that's there. They understand both really, really well. So be careful with your math because your CFO will school you if you're not careful on just, here's a number, how'd you get it? And you got to be able to back up the data. But it's about risk, but it's also about how you visualize that risk. So businesses are about, tell me rack, stank, order. What's my business risk? But if this is the business risk, ransomware, shutting down factories, shutting down offices, okay, that is probably the top list or at least the top 3 list. Okay, what are you doing about it? Is it exceptional? Is it beyond where you feel comfortable with something? And in that case, it's like it's outside my risk curve that says my risk tolerance curve that goes across there that says, hey, this is above where I want it to be. How do you bring it down? Spend money on technology or people, create new processes. Those are your 3 options. Literally at that level, you've got those 3 selections that you can do. So you can lower it and bring it inside your risk tolerance curve. But that issue is that it tells the story. If you give me $1 million, I will lower this risk. So my KPI for next year, guess what? This moves. We use what we refer to as a bubble chart. It's a standard risk matrix that is impact across the top, likelihood across the on the x-axis on that side of it, and you chart. And you can see that you can have a conversation. It's real easy to say, and you can't boil the ocean on top of this. So you typically go, here's 15 risks for the business. It's not up to me to determine that risk. The business has already determined that risk for me. I may have had some influence in it, but they've already determined it. So you chart these bubbles and you plot your curve and says, here's your risk acceptance. These bubbles are out. But you can't boil the ocean. I have a pretty large team. I support 77,000 people across the world. So I have a pretty large team that's there. We handle 10 things. We put 15 on there and tell the business, we're not touching these 5. Maybe because they're under the risk tolerance curve, or we don't think it's an issue, or it's going to cost way too much money to fix this. We should just throw it away and get something new. You need to have those discussions because it's a story. You start with the risk, you do the change. At the end of the outcome, I can chart your ROI that says, hey, you invested this, we reduced this to there. You may have to invest more money next year because the threat keeps going up. Or maybe it's now and it may change. My biggest risk was ransomware. Next year, it may be third parties. And the following year, maybe insider threat, and followed by, you're going to do things, but you have to limit yourself. And the business needs to know what you're not doing just as well as what you're doing. Because if something bad happens on what you're not doing, and you never said anything, you're probably on the exit path on that side of it that's there.
Julie?
I think one of the things that I'm hearing from this and sort of seeing anecdotally as well is so much of our conversation about cybersecurity and privacy lives kind of at the lower level of where the systems are built and where the processes are happening. And it's often not connected to that broader view of risk management. And so how do we pull that into the enterprise risk view? And this is where I've seen things like the NIST cybersecurity framework and privacy framework be really helpful communication tools for elevating that conversation out of the server room up to the boardroom and everywhere in between. Both of those frameworks have this profiles concept built into them where you take those menu of cybersecurity or privacy activities and outcomes you may want to achieve and start connecting those to your objectives as an organization and what you do every day. And that becomes a very powerful strategic planning tool. But when you start mapping cybersecurity activities or privacy activities to those objectives, you can prioritize a lot more effectively instead of just doing cybersecurity for cybersecurity's sake or the new tool because it's the hot new thing. You now know, hey, this is going to help my number one objective. This is really critical for me to do. Or, this is maybe not so appropriate or for our spend this year. Maybe we'll just do this by policy for now and get a tool next year when we have new budget. So pretty effective for
Yeah,
management.
I think you bring up a really good point, is that it has to cover all layers. Because if I decide to go, I want to do, example, multi-factor authentication. I just decide on multi-factor authentication, say this is what we're going to do. Never talk to the IT folks, never talk to the IAM folks. I'm in trouble because they're like, oh, we're not planning that. We're not set up for that. We're not capable of doing that. So if I just go blind in that, I may have a resource constraint. I may have a development constraint. I may have, this is not going to work constraint that I may have bought into. So you really have to start at the grassroots level and bring it up, because you really need to get buy-in from those other groups. Because I don't have hands and feet in IT. I have my own people that are doing their administration. They're not going to take over my Active Directory or my IDP implementations of that. I need to rely on people to be able to do it. I need hands and feet. And if they're busy, I may go, well, we're going to do this in the first 6 months. And it's like, well, not really. You're going to do this in the last quarter. And you need to get that built in, get the snowball rolling down the hill. That's the way I look at it, because it will eventually get enough momentum that it will push the right thing. Plus, it changes the security culture dynamics as part of that.
I'll try to keep us on track with time as well here now, since we have 10 minutes or so left. But I will probably wrap that particular question with one of the remarks. When this Russia-Ukraine crisis happened very recently, as you know, there were a number of companies that appeared on the list of anonymous. And in this list was 3 of my own clients that appeared. And these are Fortune 250 companies I'm talking about. This question about the KPIs and KRIs, because everything you said is very appropriate and very relevant to them. And the first question that the board asked their teams, what are KPIs and KRIs? What are we really managing? And guess what? None of them had anything meaningful to represent. And these are Fortune 250 companies. These are not the ones that don't really spend much, or like, they have all the kind of access to all the tools and everything. That said, Stephen, let me ask you this. Does the KPIs and KRIs that the board and the C-suite, are they the same for all kind of enterprises, or do they vary based on the size and the nature of the enterprise?
That's a good one. I sort of view, when you're meeting with the board, they are on your side. And this is a really orthogonal discussion for almost anyone in IT or cybersecurity. Most of those board members are former chief operating officers, financial officers, auditors, CEOs, and they want to be involved because they care. And they like to know what's going to happen, not how it's going to happen. And that's where you have to normalize the data. I think, Rich, what you mentioned makes a lot of sense. Working with the board, it's about measuring the level of risk and exposure you happen to have and putting it into layman's terms. Many of them are absolutely brilliant, but they don't understand 3-letter acronyms. If you say zero trust architecture or XDR, you've lost them in less than 5 seconds and the meeting's over. They really aren't interested in patch management or your 7-day, 24-hour, 1-hour emergency response plan for getting those patches deployed. They want to know a couple of key themes. What is our risk exposure? Number 2, where is that risk coming from? Number 3, have we put in place the appropriate controls to make sure we can manage it in an acceptable fashion? And if we can't, what's our financial exposure? That's the conversation they really want to have. And by the way, never once did I go back and talk about MFA or XDR or all the acronyms. Save that for later. They want to have a financial discussion and have the seating at the table.
Yeah, I think one of the things about KPIs is one of the rules, they have to be measurable. And if you can't measure it, it's not a KPI. And that's one of the things that cybersecurity struggles with. How do I measure risk? Or how do I measure things that I'm deploying and things around that? So be careful with what you're trying to come up with and don't make it easy. Just here's the result, because there has to be an impact that goes with that. We deployed this and look, the attacks went down. I've got data centers that I knocked down on a week, about 750 million attacks get down. I can measure that and I can say, hey, I deployed this technology and I reduced my internet traffic almost by 50% because it was 50% bad stuff trying to get in nature of that. That's something that's measurable. But if I just said it's better, the board's going to look at you and throw you out at that point in time. They want measurable results that you have to be quantified for on that side.
Yeah. You know, interestingly, when we talk about KPIs, KRIs, and measuring the risk, what are you really measuring the risk against? So when you go and we get asked to do security risk assessments all the time. And you go and start doing the risk assessment by asking what you're doing here for MFA, for this and everything, rather starting with what is your list of assets? What's your digital asset repository that you're protecting? Show me that first. I've yet have to see a good answer to that question. More importantly, this is my 100% repository. So what I'm trying to say is the basics, the fundamentals are often found missing, which leads me to the next question. So what are the frameworks or the point of reference should we follow to have some kind of standardization so that we understand how to measure security risk? Like if I am going to sports, right? Football, I know how to see the score, the standard around it. I know how to measure some certain things. How do I measure security risk? What are those standards and the frameworks to help with this KPIs, KRIs, and risk management? Let's start with you, Richard, again.
Yeah, I think it's one of the things that you have qualitative and quantitative sides and different frameworks that's there. Also, the frameworks are usually designed and been applied to different things. So if you're in the manufacturing sector and some of the things, ISO becomes one of those areas because people want you to be ISO compliant because it covers a lot of different things. NIST CSF is another area that says, yeah, I can measure myself and I don't need to go back to the other side of it and go impact the business and trying to do policies, controls, kind of functions that are there. I think you run into this that we're running into. There are now a lot of different frameworks that are required by different organizations to be there. So you end up with now, it's not just, hey, here's our standard. Now we got to cover all of these. And 20 years ago, you would typically go, we're going to roll our own framework that we're going to use and take the best practices of that. But it changes over a period of time. ISO just changed not too long ago, which is creating a conundrum inside of organizations. And it hadn't changed for 13 years. So you can just imagine the changes that occurred. These are going to continue to adapt and move that's there. They're great resources to go in and say, okay, here's where we're at. And they're great tools to figure out, are we good, lucky, or we're just not a target on that side of it? You can figure yourself out by using those.
So Julie, I'm going to ask you on the very same question, something about privacy. Even though security, after all this many years, we have heard like chief security officers, we have big teams around security. How many organizations still even have a chief privacy officer? How many of they're really doing like privacy impact assessments or really understand about privacy? And we've been talking about privacy pretty much around the same time as security. So what do we need to do to change that behavior that organizations have today? So the privacy, like why is not adopted that widely today? What are we missing there?
Sorry, there's an echo up here, so it makes it a little hard to hear what everybody on the stage is saying. So what's missing? Gosh. I think with privacy impact assessments in particular, so those are a form of risk assessments. Again, it's sort of a vocabulary challenge, right? Like starting with that definition of privacy, starting with the fundamentals of how the things people are held accountable for. A lot of privacy is still very compliance driven when really it needs to be a risk management discipline. And so we have these things called the fair information practice principles that are built into pretty much every privacy law and regulation across the globe, even though those laws and regulations don't otherwise say the same things. So a lot of the privacy risk assessments that we do tend to be oriented around those fair information practices. Those are focused though on organizational behaviors. So things like, are you transparent? Are you minimizing the data? Those types of things. They don't often get at what goes wrong for individuals. And when NIST was going through the process of developing the cybersecurity framework, the executive order that called for that framework to have a privacy methodology, they couldn't get to consensus at the time to say much more than a few paragraphs. So if you go back and look at what's in there, it doesn't tell you much. They later took action to do research and say, okay, well, part of the challenge was we didn't have a way of talking about the harms and the ways people experience privacy issues. So let's go research that. So they did research over the years between the cybersecurity framework and the privacy framework. But that vocabulary and a lot of that research has mostly lived in sort of academic circles where it's not yet fully translated into something that's digestible and consumable for everyday organizations. And so I think we still have a lot of work to do to get that, what goes wrong for the human on the other end of the data into our conversations in a way that's meaningful.
Yes.
Thanks, I appreciate it. Just as a follow-up, for those of you well-versed in the industry, the best thing about having a framework is commonality, benchmarks, baselines. The worst thing is that it's used against you in a gap analysis, and all you see is red versus all the good things that occur. And unfortunately, in the world of cybersecurity, you only get noticed for one thing, when things go wrong. So the reason I bring this storyline up is that if you aren't using a framework and you're not using your own rating system today, be wary that others are actually doing it for you, and they're passing judgment on you without you knowing. That information is now impacting not just your company, your brand, your reputation, your investors, and your board of directors, because they are passing judgment based upon what they can see outside into your environment. It may not always be the truth, let alone capture everything that's being done correctly inside around risk mitigation and controls. So realize, because these frameworks exist and they're third parties, they are passing judgment on you already that your board is being impacted by, including your investors. So be leery of that.
This is wonderful. So let's wrap this session by one of the most important questions. From all your experience that you've done, what would be that one or two things as an advice to this audience that they should go back and say, this is something that you need to work with your organization, with your C-suite, with your board to make a real impact when it comes to security and privacy in the environment?
Easy one. Assume you're already compromised. Assume you've already been compromised because you have, and you just don't know it. It's not a badge of dishonor to admit that up front. And then you can work on the the identification, protection, mitigation, mediation, and recovery. If you sit there and try to prove your innocence for 2 years worth of time, you've just lost that effort to actually go ahead and solve the problem and cleanse the environment. So assume you're compromised, apply proper hygiene, and then you can use all the advanced cybersecurity techniques behind it. But get the basics right, and you'll find tremendous velocity.
Beware of the shiny object syndrome, and that can come out in several different ways. Sometimes it's the, oh my gosh, I need to buy the new tool because this is what everybody's talking about, and this is what they're saying we should do. So that's one facet of it. The other facet of it is the shiny object syndrome with what you're designing and building and thinking about, is this embodying the values that we intend to as an organization? Are we so focused on this new capability or this new innovation that we can't wait to get to market that we're forgetting to consider what kinds of impacts it might have socially on people, and how is that technology going to be used? How might it be misused? And thinking about some of those risks that you might be introducing that you might not intend to.
Now, I think there's a couple of things. One, to use one of the NIST frameworks of identification. We suck at knowing what's on our networks and everything else. If you ever want to throw a CIO under the bus because he threw you under the bus, have somebody ask him how many assets you actually have, and don't give me, oh, it's like 45,000 or so. No, it should be a number. that you always know. So identification of the assets that are involved in that. Basic hygiene is part of that that's there. I can't apply hygiene if I don't know the assets that I have on my network. That is the first thing. And if you haven't started that, you need to go back. Security is a journey that's there. It's not a destination. It's not somewhere I'm going to get to on that side. I may walk, fly, travel, have wrong turns, get flat tires, get delays and everything else. It is a journey that you're going to do. But if I'm standing here and not moved, I have not started it yet. So you have to do something. Security is about do, not thinking, not doing, have to do.
Now, and I hope the audience got a lot from this, and I might open for maybe a question or two if time allows. I'm not sure how much time we got left here. But that being said, I'll probably add a couple data points to that. Ask yourself a question: why do the bad actors come after you? Because they have a motivation and they get rewarded. What is the reward and motivation for your internal organization to defend you? What if I told you, if you defend me, I'm going to give you $1 million as a price? What would that change in behavior? That rewarding behavior does not exist for this side. It exists the other way around. And I think everyone will be motivated to do that. Number two, where we first started, the complexity itself. Simplify that. And I think we are at a time and a point now where we need to kind of stop dealing with tools and technologies every time something is thrown. Let's just focus on the outcomes, make it measurable, make it objective, make it simple enough so you can follow along. If you can take that, I think you'll go much ahead in your security programs and the privacy programs in your organization. So with that, thank you so much. And thank you, panel, for sharing your thoughts. This was important. I hope the audience kind of enjoyed the session here too. But we'll be around, so feel free to stop by and ask any other questions.